Okay, welcome to the 2018-2019 Ontario University of Commerce English Lecture Series, and this is our first lecture of the season. It is lecture series number 111. The speaker today is Eli K.P. William. He flew in today from Tokyo for us. He is a science fiction author, and as you can see, he has 2 books out now. The title of his talk today is Good Place, Bad Place, Lessons from Speculative Fiction About the World We Want. Please welcome Eli K.P. William.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Sean just said, my name is Eli K.P. William, and I'm the author of a science fiction trilogy called the Jubilee Cycle. And what you see before you here are the first 2 books, Cash Crash Jubilee and The Naked World, which will be central to what I'll be talking to you about today. Although I've been living in Japan for nearly a decade now, this is only my second time in Hokkaido and my first time in Otaru. So many thanks to Sean Klenke and the Otaru University of Commerce for hosting me. I'm truly delighted to have this opportunity to speak before you today. The title of my talk, as Sean just said, is Good Place, Bad Place, Lessons from Speculative Fiction About the World We Seek. I'm going to start off by telling you about my trilogy, the Jubilee Cycle, focusing on the 2 books that have been published so far, Cash Crash Jubilee and The Naked World. My work is often classified as dystopian fiction. So I'll proceed to explain to you my understanding of this genre and its closely related sister genre, utopian fiction. I'll then try to convince you that dystopias and utopias are interconnected facets of our world, and conclude by considering what implications this might have for our present and the futures we all seek. First of all, the Jubilee Cycle. So this, as I said, is an SF trilogy, and it's set in a near-future Tokyo in which all actions are intellectual properties owned by corporations that charge licensing fees. All actions are intellectual properties owned by corporations that charge licensing fees. So anything that you do, whether you're listening to this lecture now, or walking, or talking, or eating, that costs a certain amount of money, and you have to pay the corporation that owns that action. This is the basic premise of the Jubilee Cycle. And in Book 1, Cash Crash Jubilee, we meet the main character of the series. His name is Amon Kenzaki, and he is a liquidator. So his job is to cash crash people who've gone bankrupt. He captures people who've gone bankrupt, and he removes the computer system from their body that allows them to connect to the economy, and then he banishes them to a place called the bank death camps. He has a dream of a forest that he wants to visit, and so he's saving money to go there, and things seem to be going well until he's charged for an action called Jubilee that's incredibly expensive and that he's sure he hasn't performed. And so he starts to investigate this action, Jubilee, and is eventually led to visit the bank death camps himself. And that is the setting of The Naked World. So the bank death camps are, the biggest bank death camp on Earth is called the District of Dreams. This is an island in Tokyo Bay. And Amon goes there in search of Roshana Burla. She is the heiress of the world's largest mega conglomerate. It's called Fertilex. And Fertilex was the owner of the action Jubilee. And so he believes that Roshana Burla will have some insight into the nature of the Jubilee mystery. And in the process of traveling through the District of Dreams, Amon ends up living in a community called Xenosys. It's a failed humanitarian organization, and he becomes friends with the people there, and they gather together to fight against an organization called the Philanthropy Syndicate that supplies the impoverished people who live in the bank death camps. So that's the basic idea of book 1 and book 2. The final book in the series, A Diamond Dream, will be coming out in 2009. So in reviews, my work is often categorized as cyberpunk. While I agree that the Jubilee Cycle is indeed closely related to the cyberpunk genre, I believe that overall it is better thought of as dystopian. The best description I have found so far is this one from the online Encyclopedia of SF. Cyberpunk inflected dystopian SF. Let's break down the meaning of this phrase, starting with SF. Traditionally, SF was an acronym for science fiction. However, much of what we usually think of as science fiction has little to do with science. The most well-known and perhaps egregious example of this is the Star Wars franchise, in which the laws of physics are routinely flouted and magic is used in the form of the Force. I think Star Wars is better described as a variety of space opera than as science fiction. It would be fair, however, to label it as SF if we render this term instead as speculative fiction. This more inclusive phrase subsumes not only science fiction, but all genres set in worlds distinct from our own, including works of fantasy and horror such as The Lord of the Rings and The Stand, which you can see right here. Cyberpunk is a subgenre of SF born in the early 1980s that is characterized by a punk aesthetic, technological modification of the body, and virtual realities, sometimes called cyberspace. Typical examples include William Gibson's novel Neuromancer, which is often credited with inaugurating the genre, the animes Akira and Ghost in the Shell, and the movie The Matrix. Cyberpunk will not concern us today, as I will instead focus on the broader dystopian tradition from here on. First, I'd like to take a short detour and begin by describing the much older utopian tradition in which the dystopian tradition finds its roots. Although utopian literature goes back at least as far as Plato's Republic, written in ancient Greece, the term utopia was coined by the 16th century humanist thinker Thomas More. Utopia is the title of his fictional travelogue. U means non, and topos or topia means place in Greek. So utopia means something like no place. However, utopia sounds the same as utopia spelled with EU, which means beautiful or good place. So it seems that the title Utopia was a play on words, suggesting a place that is both non-existent and beautiful, that is, an ideal place. In keeping with the idea contained in this pun, More's travelogue is primarily about a fictional island called Utopia, where citizens live peaceful, harmonious lives of leisure and intellectual fulfillment, without private property or money of any kind. Though interpretations of the book vary, it seems that More wanted his readers to take this society as the ideal, or at least to use it as a point of contrast to reveal the moral failings of his era, including what he saw as the abuse of private property, as numerous serfs were being kicked off of their ancestral lands. In the centuries after More's death, countless authors would write books imagining their own ideal societies, including Francis Bacon in his New Atlantis, Jonathan Swift in the final chapter of his Gulliver's Travels, and H.G. Wells in New Utopia. Eventually, the term utopia would come to refer to any imagined society that the author intends their readers to view as superior to the present society in which they live. Dystopia is a term that appears much later. It was reportedly coined in 1868 by the philosopher J.S. Mill during a parliamentary speech. Dystopia has the opposite meaning of utopia, not good or ideal place, but bad place. The term is used to refer to a movement in literature that is usually seen as a reaction to the utopian tradition. Whereas utopian literature imagines fantastical worlds vastly different from the present that their authors want us to emulate, dystopian works are set in bleak worlds, usually a future dominated by an oppressive overclass, in which actual aspects of our world have been taken to the extreme. The purpose of this exaggeration of present trends is to show us how dangerous they are. In this sense, dystopian works serve as warnings or so-called cautionary tales. The dystopian text that perhaps best exemplifies the genre is George Orwell's novel 1984. Writing in 1947, Orwell observed the use of surveillance equipment, such as cameras, and the spread of totalitarian governments in his era, and took these to their logical or perhaps illogical conclusion in an imagined future that may or may not be the year 1984. The government in 1984 is supposedly ruled by a man named Big Brother, who watches all citizens through ubiquitous camera-cum televisions called telescreens. In the information age in which we all walk around with cameras and screens in our pockets, this hardly seems like a surprising idea. But it is precisely the accuracy of 1984's insights and the perennial relevance of the political dangers it depicted so early on that has continued to attract readers since it was published nearly 70 years ago. So, utopian and dystopian literature can be seen as two sides of the same coin. Utopian literature provides us with an ideal society and implicitly urges us to aim for it by showing us how good our society might be. Dystopian literature, on the other hand, provides us with a nightmare to illustrate how horribly wrong our society might go, and urges us to change our present course to prevent this from coming about. This is a somewhat simplified picture of two complex and varied traditions, but it will serve us well enough for this discussion. Many liberal thinkers such as Isaiah Berlin and Karl Popper have pointed out the danger of utopianism. What I mean by utopianism is any mode of thought or practice that actively aims to realize a particular ideal vision of how the world ought to be. In other words, a movement that seeks to bring a particular utopia into being. The danger here is that there is always a gap between present reality and any ideal we might imagine. This means that when large groups of people actively try to make our world identical to their imagined ideal world, they have to force reality to fit with the ideal. Historically, this has resulted in the worst that humanity is capable of. Allow me to provide some well-known examples. The image behind me is the Nazi insignia. Nazism is a common target of utopian critics. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler in the 1930s and 1940s, claimed to have inaugurated a new era in Germany called the Third Reich. This political movement was driven in part by an ideal of racial purity. Human beings were seen as divided into races that were arranged in a hierarchy. At the top were Aryan races, with the Nordic race being purest among them. And at the bottom were Jews, the Roma, people with dark skin, and other ethnic groups. The Nazis believed that in order to purify humanity, the Nordic race had to conquer the world and exterminate inferior races. The results are all too familiar. World War II, the devastation of Europe, the collapse of Germany, the Holocaust, the birth of atomic weaponry, and the beginning of the Cold War. Let's look at another example. This is an image of the Japanese flag spreading across the Japanese Empire at its height in the early 1940s. At the time, the imperial regime in Tokyo sought to create what it called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This was to be a bloc of Asian nations led by Japan that would liberate the region from the powers of the West and trade peacefully with each other. Unlike Nazi racial purity, which seems despicable to most of us in the 21st century, it's easy to understand why this ideal of mutual cooperation inspired both the Japanese citizenry and many throughout the Asia-Pacific region, as it promised them independence after years of colonization. The result, however, was the installation of several puppet regimes, massacres, famine back home in Japan, as well as resource shortages, and finally Japan's cataclysmic defeat. This is an image of the Palace of the Soviets that was supposed to serve as a congressional building in Moscow, but was never completed due to the German invasion in 1941. Communism has taken many forms since permutations of Karl Marx's ideas started going into practice in the early 20th century. Some versions of the communist political experiment have turned out better than others, but most, or perhaps all, have been driven by the ideal of a classless society. The working class, or proletariat, would rise up in revolution to overthrow the ruling class, or bourgeoisie, in order to seize the means of production and eliminate private property, thereby establishing a society without classes. This ideal state of equality and leisure bears much resemblance to the original utopia imagined by Thomas More, and has appealed to countless millions since it was conceived. Yet in pursuit of some version of this ideal, communist regimes have engaged in the murder of tens of millions, ethnic cleansing, and other crimes against humanity on a mass scale. So it seems that utopian visions of the future, whether as a racially pure Third Reich, an independent Asia for Asians, or a classless society, can lead to atrocities when attempts are made to realize them in practice. In other words, our pursuit of good places, of the ideal, of utopia, can result paradoxically in the opposite, in bad places, in dystopias. Although no one consciously seeks to realize dystopias, they seem to tag along with our utopian dreams like a shadow. The examples I've given so far are some of the more obvious cases of utopian visions gone wrong. They all center around so-called totalitarian regimes, societies in which the state exerts complete control over all aspects of life. In standard versions of the argument against utopianism, it is said to be dangerous because it leads to the creation of such ultra-authoritarian political systems. But if we expand the meaning of utopia, then we can see that the dystopian danger follows in the wake of liberal democratic societies as well. The image here is the flag of the East India Company, a massive multinational corporation that played a central role in the British Empire almost from its beginnings. The expansion of the British Empire from the late 16th century until its collapse in the mid-20th was motivated in part by visions of a civilized world. Much of the world was seen as overrun by savages ruled by barbaric superstition. Colonies had to be set up to bring these unfortunate brutes civilization and rule them for their own good. This white man's burden, as Rudyard Kipling famously called it in a poem of that name, was seen as a sort of moral duty. Conveniently, the companies that operated the colonies gained a large supply of raw materials, exotic products, cheap labor, and land, which helped to enrich their investors back home. In the process, brutal wars were waged over rights to these colonies. Native populations were wiped out or suppressed. Millions of Africans were enslaved, and formerly harmonious cultures were pitted against each other in brutal conflicts, some of which persist to this day, such as the tension between India and Pakistan or Israel and Palestine. So the pursuit of an ideal of civilization in one form or another has scattered dystopias around the globe, even though the protagonist of this historical shift Britain, was not totalitarian, but grew into a liberal democracy during this same period. I believe similar arguments could be made for the way utopian visions of a free, democratic world have driven American interventionism, with comparable consequences, but I won't get into that. Instead, I'd like to consider the societies we live in today in the early 21st century. As the third largest economy in the world, Japan is highly prosperous by most measures. The streets are safe, even in the enormous metropolis of Tokyo. The infrastructure is highly efficient. The customer service is almost incomparable. Japan is also incredibly rich in culture and natural beauty. But what makes all this possible? Well, salarymen and OLs drive the Japanese economy and reap the benefits thereof. Rigid social expectations exclude others from the employment market, including numerous hikikomori and poor elderly individuals who starve to death quietly in their apartments. Meanwhile, the infrastructural efficiency and customer service are enabled in large part by a highly demanding work culture that leads to a variety of social problems, including karoshi, suicide, and depression. Although I've brought up Japan in a negative light for the second time now, let me assure you that my intention here is not to pick on Japan. I'm only using it as an example because I've lived here for almost 10 years and am probably more familiar with the current situation here than anywhere else. But just to allay any suspicions of my motives, let's consider my home country, Canada. The nation of Canada is wealthy, spacious, and provides an ideal mix of nature and urban enjoyment in its cities. It has a relatively functional democracy, is fairly egalitarian, and celebrates its multicultural inclusivity. Yet our economic success is built around resource extraction, creating huge, ugly swathes of clear-cut trees and wilderness poisoned by byproducts of mining, while contributing huge amounts of CO2, including that from the notorious tar sands. The most egregious problem, perhaps, which supposedly multicultural Canada is only just beginning to face, is its mistreatment of native peoples, who suffered greatly as a result of the civilizing impulse that drove the British Empire. Many natives alive today still remember the residential schools where they were forbidden from speaking their own languages. And their communities, in many cases, have never recovered, often rife now with drug addiction and unemployment. Many lack even access to clean drinking water, built in some cases around rivers, as they were built in some cases around rivers that were poisoned by the lucrative mining operations already mentioned. So like Japan, the shining multicultural, liberal, peaceful, clean, technological, safe ideal of modern Canada has its dystopian underbelly. This is the famous photograph Earthrise, taken by astronaut William Anders from the surface of the moon in 1968. One of the first images of our blue planet, it serves as a rich symbol of the truly global perspective on our world that has only become possible since we developed technologies that allow us to reach space. Citizens of rich countries like Canada and Japan benefit immensely from the international political and economic system that currently prevails among human beings on this planet. Driven by the neoliberal vision of a global free market realized exclusively between democratic states, globalization has brought us numerous sophisticated technologies that make our lives more convenient and comfortable, such as smartphones and soon maybe self-driving cars. We enjoy an immense variety of affordable food and goods from almost anywhere you can imagine. Cures are being developed for an ever wider range of diseases, and we are living longer due to advances in medical technology. In relative terms, the occurrence of violent incidents has been dropping steadily since World War II. Celebrity academics such as Ray Kurzweil and Steven Pinker praise these changes as clear signs that our lives are better than ever before and only getting better. It almost seems as though we live in a science fictional paradise. But as SF writer William Gibson has noted, while the future is already here, it is not evenly distributed. Our futuristic lifestyle is made possible by an economic system that privileges some and debilitates others. Many countries roll from debt crisis to debt crisis, so impoverished by the structural adjustments attached to the loans they need that 1 in 8 people now live in slums. Our consumption continues to accelerate climate change, leading to wildfires, flooding, polar chills, the sinking of island nations, displacement of millions, and possibly worse to come. Plastic waste is accumulating so quickly in the oceans that some estimate that there will be more of the stuff in the oceans than fish by 2050. Meanwhile, proxy wars drag on in the Middle East. Fear of terrorism justifies a surveillance network of unprecedented scope. Democratic states are becoming more authoritarian, and tension between nuclear powers builds by the day. So whether we look at the national level or the global level, it seems that dystopias and utopias can be found throughout our planetary civilization. Those of us in the rich countries that benefit most respond to this twin reality in different ways. We all want solutions, but it's difficult to admit that the comforts we take for granted are built upon problems that we can't possibly condone. The fact that our utopias are often dystopic to the core does not make confronting this issue any easier, as many of us are psychologically paralyzed by meaningless work, dissatisfying relationships, and loneliness in the digital age. While a few concerned citizens direct their energy towards the darker side of humanity, such as activists, humanitarian organizers, and certain types of journalists, most of us cannot bear to focus on the bad places for long, and instead we divert our attention through consumption or allow ourselves to believe that progress will solve everything as a matter of course. It's this latter response to his world that Amon Kenzaki takes in Cash Crash Jubilee. While few people would classify the Jubilee Cycle as utopian literature, since the future depicted is difficult to view as desirable by almost any standard, it nonetheless contains enough positive elements that the main character believes it is a sort of utopia. While the world of the series was inspired in many ways by 1984, it is not set in a straightforward surveillance state, as there is an elaborate system of privacy protection, which is actually an improvement over the present, as we've known since Snowden's whistleblowing. The system of action monitoring is highly functional and efficient. The environment may not exactly be clean in My Future Tokyo, but global civilization still persists, riding on the back of technology, and Japan has overcome its demographic problems by accepting in immigrants and becoming somewhat multicultural. Meanwhile, war and terrorism have disappeared under global policies of Pax Economica. So, even though the world of the Jubilee Cycle is based upon the apparently dystopian system of licensing all actions for a fee, it can be viewed in a utopian light. Amon only begins to doubt it when he is charged unjustly for Jubilee and realizes that the system he had faith in can be abused. His process of investigation and realization culminates in the Naked World, with his journey to the District of Dreams, where he stares the dystopian core of his world in the face. In the world's largest bank death camp, he observes how the poor are made complacent by algorithms that calculate the perfect balance of incentives for cooperation and disincentives for resistance. The bank dead live lives of pointless toil, kept in a state of exhaustion by the need to constantly retrieve their supplies, which are programmed to dissolve after a set expiration date. Nonetheless, Amon also finds utopia in this place, in the form of community, friendship, the wonder of looking up the sky, and the pleasures of reading and imagination. So in the Jubilee Cycle, we discover dystopia in the midst of what we, or at least the characters, thought was utopia, and utopia in the midst of dystopia. I designed the world of the series in this way so that it would mirror our world, or at least how I perceive our world. Just as good places and bad places, our utopian aspirations and their dystopian side effects are inextricably bound in the present, so in my fiction. After listening to this talk so far, you may be feeling depressed. In every example I've shown you, whether past or present, human beings have caused horrible problems in the process of seeking a better world. I tried to convince you that utopia and dystopia are interconnected facets of our world. This might lead you to make the further inference that they are inextricably interconnected. This would suggest that any effort to improve our situation is doomed to failure. For if we pursue a vision of something better, we may succeed in changing our world, but only by making some aspects of it worse in the process. All human striving would then appear like the running of a hamster on its wheel. Such an outlook can only ever lead to despair. However, I would urge you not to draw this conclusion. If dystopias tend to ride on the back of utopias, then this is a fact we will indeed have to face, yet it need not force us to give up. Those of us trapped in dystopias, psychologically or materially, so focused on the struggle to simply exist that we lack the force of will to try to better the situation, have little choice in the matter. Only those of us swaddled in the comforts of our futuristic present have the luxury to indulge in such defeatism. And yet this brings its own set of dangers, as existential risks such as global warming and nuclear war are signs that none of us are safe, and that you never know when dystopia might find you. In any case, whether or not you find such pessimistic predictions persuasive, there is little point in urging that we give up on imagining a better world, as such optimistic striving is all too human to ever be completely stifled. This is the first lesson we can draw from the vast and varied utopian tradition. We will never stop thinking up realities in which we might be happier than we are now. It is our dreams, after all, that give us the hope and ambition that makes life worthwhile. The question then is not whether, but how we ought to guide and respond to that impulse. Another lesson we can draw from the dysutopian tradition is that our visions of elsewhere are always utopos, non-places, that is, mere promising fictions. Dystopian stories warn us again and again of the danger that arises when we treat those fictions as if they were actual, trying to force the bumpy, misshapen blob that is reality into the square hole of the ideal. This does not necessarily mean that our utopian dreams need be modest, as that would merely leave us in thrall to common sense and entrap us forever in the unqueried beliefs of the status quo, which has its own set of attendant dangers. However, we must acknowledge those dreams for the nebulous hopes that they represent, and never privilege them above what we know to be just and right in the here and now. I could offer a number of other thoughts about the kind of constraints that should guide our utopian strivings, but these would take us far beyond the lessons we can learn from speculative fiction alone, which is the topic of this talk, so I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Eli, you want to open it up for questions?
Yes. Does anyone have any questions? I know. I imagine that was a lot to take in.
Any questions? I have a question.
Yes.
Has a question. The Soviet Congress building that you showed earlier, do you know offhand if that has any relationship to the Seven Sisters buildings that are in the same style?
I don't. I actually don't know the Seven Sisters. Is that a Russian?
Yeah, there's seven
building?
Stalinist buildings. The Moscow State University building, the Sky building, and several other buildings. But they look very similar to that building. So
Okay.
there must be some connection between them.
Yeah, maybe. Who knows? Yeah, maybe the abandoned plans of that building were reinvigorated or
I
something.
suspect they probably were. Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Okay.
I'll
Well.
ask another one. Eli, what led you to want to write this triptych, the Jubilee series?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I find with writing dystopian fiction that you're kind of driven by two impulses. So one of them is aesthetic, and one of them is political. And so I think without the aesthetic impulse, maybe I would be, I don't know, an investigative journalist, or I would be studying political science somewhere. So the aesthetic impulse is what pushes me towards wanting to write fiction, and to choose fiction as the form to express the ideas that I have. And then the political impulse is what narrows down my fiction to the dystopian genre, because, as I've been talking about today, the dystopian genre provides a particular way of approaching political issues. And my goal in the series isn't to provide answers, because I'm not a big fan generally of didactic fiction. I think the job of the novelist is to ask questions. So I'm trying to ask a lot of questions about politics and the sort of course of global civilization. And so this series is a way for me to do that.
Other questions?
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, I'm going to move on to the reading now. So I'll be reading to you from The Naked World. So, as I said, this is the second book in the Jubilee Cycle trilogy. And the section that I will be reading to you from is about a third of the way into the book. So at this stage, Amon has already, so my main character, Amon Kenzaki, he's in his investigation of the mysterious Jubilee charge. He has ended up in the District of Dreams, which, as I said, is the largest bank death camp on Earth, on an island in Tokyo Bay. And previously, his job as a liquidator was to send people to the District of Dreams, people who went bankrupt. And so now he's ended up there himself. And I haven't told you about this, but aside from the system of action monitoring, people in Tokyo, they wear a computer system, or rather, there's a computer system implanted in their body that allows them to connect to this action monitoring system, the action transaction market, but also to a network of information and images called the Imanet. It's like the internet, except the information and images is all over the world. So, Amon in The Naked World, I'm playing with this word naked, and it has various meanings in the series, but one of the meanings is naked in the sense of being cut off from information and from the economy. So Amon has grown up in a society in which everyone has this computer system and sees the world through the lens of this information network. And suddenly it's gone, and so he is adjusting, and he's actually suffering from a condition called web loss, which has various symptoms, including hallucinations, memory problems, cognitive deficits. He has trouble navigating without his navigation apps. And so he's struggling with this condition, web loss, and he's ended up in this community, this failed humanitarian organization called Xenosys. And he's on a trial period there. He's not even sure if they're going to accept him. And so he asks this character, Book. Book is in charge of the library in Xenosys. He asks him for advice. How can I deal with this problem of web loss? And Book's suggestion is to read a book. And because of his cognitive deficits due to web loss, Amon actually can't read. Text appears scrambled. He can't parse it. So he goes to the library, but everything just looks like a jumble. And except there's one book, and whose title he can read, and that is Woman in the Dunes by Kobo Abe. So he picks that book up, and he can't actually read what's inside it, but as he's scrolling through the text, he gets this very strange feeling. And so the scene I'm going to read for you begins with him trying to cope with this feeling that this book has given him. And I should mention also that Aman, because of the information and images that cover everything, he's never seen the sky before, the naked sky before. The feeling stuck with him day after day, night after night, and it became progressively harder to get up each morning. Soon his hallucinations returned, the jingles and laugh tracks, the service announcement survival marathons, and mixed martial art beauty creams, now humming with a sort of diabolic vibration that made him want to throw up. He found thoughts of those he had sent here, filling the cognitive vacuum. He imagined a bloodthirsty gang of them swarming him while he worked outside, or creeping into the elevator to throttle him while he slept. Sometimes in the dark, he remembered their screams one by one, 10,000 distinct voices decrying the pain he had caused, and goosebumps prickled his skin all over. By about the 7th day, he still managed to rise from his floor, but the long plunge off the end of steps and ledges he encountered on his construction course seemed to beckon, the erasure of choices appearing so much more attractive than any other choice he might make. The forest dream had not visited him once since he crossed the Sanzu River, nor had any other dream, and the air seemed to fill with a sort of sandpaper heaviness, so that each breath weighed him down while scraping him away from the inside. Everything he sought seemed destined for failure. His job gone, Mayuko lost, the answers forever out of reach. For what did a lowly bank dead in the pit of all humanity, brain damaged and incompetent, hope to achieve? Did he seriously think that he might get out of the district of dreams and make a difference when he had to use every ounce of energy just to stay alive? Just to climb across a wasteland and labor away for a few morsels before climbing his way back again? Then one night, as he was plodding his way back to his room, Aman felt a breeze blowing from above that reminded him of something, though he wasn't sure what. It was a cool end-of-summer breeze carrying a sad hint of fall, and he stopped to let it stroke his skin in the steaming air, knowing somehow that he'd felt one just like it long ago. The breeze touched him intermittently, channeled down a stair-path crevice from above to the rooftop where he stood, and he tried to connect the sensation to a fragment of his past. But every time he sensed the moment drawing closer, the breeze ceased, forcing him to start the reminiscing all over when it returned. Minutes passed, and soon the feeling of having a memory approach and yet always remain just out of reach became unbearable. So he began to climb in the direction of the wind, searching for higher ground where its mnemonic power blew more steadily. He had passed this stair path many times, but had never once taken it because it always seemed too crowded. That night was no exception, as he was bumped and jostled by those going steadily up and down. The path first took him to the end of a crevice where it began to slant sharply and then spiral around several shafts, transitioning into zigzagging tall alleys and winding tunnels, the breeze growing stronger and more persistent with each step as he hiked higher than ever before. Aman was beginning to wonder where so many people were going at this hour when he stepped out onto a packed rooftop, glanced up, and immediately caught his breath. There, high above, was the night sky. A mere thin slice of stars in a crack in the roofscape canopy, to be sure, but all the more powerful for Aman because it was his first sighting. During his bank life, the clear night sky had been obscured by infostars, configuring themselves hypnotically into Megaguan logos, and after his bank death, his vision had been too damaged. Then he had been locked up in the elevator, and when he was allowed to walk around alone, he was always overshadowed by the leaning, looming structures or the clouds overhead. Now he was seeing the naked stars, unadulterated, untainted, unveiled but for the faintest haze of smog, and stood shoulder to shoulder with the other denizens, gazing upwards so intently it seemed like hours before he realized they were all doing the same. Considering only its appearance, the night sky didn't seem like much, just a bunch of twinkling lights, really. The digital light of free Tokyo had had more color, more variation in shape and tone, fizzling and blazing in dazzling patterns. But even with the blinking satellites scrolling relentlessly by, there was no denying that it touched him in a special way. Although the stars were indistinguishable from the infostars graphically, there was something imperceptibly different about them, the wonder he felt in his bones banishing all doubt, as though it rang the pith of his inner unknown like a bell. He hardly noticed the bodies shifting around him as people came and went. Chattering voices kept low by the celestial reverence they all instinctively shared. And it wasn't until he was finally trudging drowsily to his elevator, well into the midnight hours, that he sensed his dread was gone and slept soundly for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. After his first stargazing experience, Amon never felt the memory-laden breeze again. And finding himself too busy and tired to climb that same stair path after work for the following few days, he continued visiting the library instead. Yet he noticed that the sky was visible along his routine course much more than he had first realized. When some task brought him up high now and then, the overlapping shafts would sometimes open up in just the right way to expose a sliver in the distance above. Or if he was lucky, there would be a sprinkle of sky, multiple little tears in the roofscape visible from a single spot. Often these small openings were shrouded in flakes and a smog-like mist, or filled with the careening black arc of crows, the only place Amon ever saw them. But beyond these obstructions, inside the jagged openings in the slumscape, the sky was invariably there behind everything in the world. And he realized that it had always been there, behind the info sky, revealing itself occasionally when the swirling surge of videos and images would die down for a moment, like the view through a curtain blowing in the wind. He simply hadn't noticed, as these ephemeral glimpses were rare and had never seemed worth attending to until now, any more than a blank screen. He was surprised by how often he could see the moon. It traced a very particular trajectory in the sky, and yet was frequently aligned with his elevated viewing spots. He soon learned that Xenocyst had been intentionally designed this way, the whole slumscape reconstructed in accordance with the seasons to allow in a healthy amount of sun to the upper levels during the day, and to make the moon visible at night. Since few had calendars, this allowed the residents to keep track of the passage of time and connect with something that Amon was only just beginning to understand. Once he felt a spike of light glance down upon him while he worked, and followed it upwards, only to find a strange absence awaiting his gaze, a visual lacuna that was neither black nor white, nor any color, floating in a crack in the toy block overhang from which the bright heat shining around him radiated. Then he had to look away, the sun still too much for his eyes and mind to handle. He was reminded of how little he knew, how many questions lay unanswered. Who was Hippo? Vertical? Tai? The two books? What were they doing in Xenocyst? And what was this community all about? Then there was Delivery, with its strange slogan, and the Opportunity Scientists. Gradually he was learning about different facets of the District of Dreams, but this solar anomaly seemed to lay bare his ignorance, and filled him with a sort of jittery curiosity that nothing in his bounded routine could satiate. In certain frames of mind, when he looked up at a particular shred of sky, sapped of all promotainment, he found it dismally barren and banal, just something to keep the eye busy while working or performing some other task. And without his forecast apps, he found the weather annoyingly unpredictable, unable to see what the incessant changes of the sky could be for. The haze covered its azure in the daytime without any personalization to his preferences or biometrics. The clouds formed and drifted off one after the other without concern for his actions or his wants. The blue lightened and darkened and deepened without anyone losing or earning a single yen. It just changed according to its own inscrutable principles, completely irrelevant to human existence. Sometimes its pointlessness seemed so grave that Amon hated the sky and wanted nothing more than to somehow get it under his heel, to piss the pigment of his obsessions and neuroses all over it. But he couldn't forget the power of the stars that night, and found his eyes drawn upwards at every opportunity, hoping for a reprise from the quotidian grind, however brief and incomplete it might be. Thank you. Well, are there any final questions?
Anyone need to ask a question? Please.
If not, once again, many thanks to Sean Clanky for the invitation and for the Otaru University of Commerce for hosting me. It was a pleasure to speak to you today. Thank you very much.